Are back in Echo, chapter 21, and Mike is getting ready for his audition. The next day, Mike sailed through the first round at the YMCA. A week later, after the semifinals at the Baptist Temple, he moved on to the finals. Now, after yet another week had passed, he was walking down the long corridor at City Hall toward the mayor's reception room. He could hardly believe that he'd made it this far, or that the summer was almost over. Aunt Eunie, Mr. Howard, and Frankie followed alongside until they all reached the door with a sign on it, "Waiting room for finalists only." "Why can't we go in too?" asked Frankie. "The finals are closed auditions," said Aunt Eunie. "We'll see Michael when it's over." Frankie looked up at him. "Good luck, Mike." Mike tousled Frankie's hair. "Thanks, kid." Mr. Howard shook his hand and stepped back. "I'll hope for the best." Aunt Eunie put a hand on his arm. "I've heard what you can do, and I think you're remarkable, and Mr. Potter couldn't be more proud." She smiled. "I should have said this before, Michael. Everything you asked me that day in the library, it has all been resolved. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Thank you for keeping your promise about Frankie." "It's not just the promise about Frankie, it's about you too." "I know," he said. He did understand. She'd kept her promise to him, making all this possible. Tomorrow was the concert, and next week he'd know by a letter in the mail if he'd made the band, and that would determine whether or not he'd be going back to Bishop's. I want to stop there. That's what's going on in Mike's head, but do you think that's the truth? Do you think that she is planning on that she would send him back to Bishop's? Think about that. As Mike watched Aunt Eunie and Mr. Howard and Frankie walk away holding hands down the corridor, his heart ached. He took a deep breath and forced himself to stop wanting something he couldn't have. He had to focus on the competition. Another boy rushed toward the door. "Hey," he said, "you're the redhead everyone's talking about. I saw you at the semifinals. Good luck today." "Thanks, you too," said Mike, grabbing the door, holding it open and following him inside. Wow, the fact that that boy said everyone was talking about him, what does that mean? It means that he's good, isn't it? Finalists crowded every corner. Harmonica chords, octave runs, and phrasing from my old Kentucky home filled the room. A volunteer wearing a women's auxiliary sash walked among them, passing out the day's schedule. Boys counseled one another. "What time slot did you get?" "Later is best. They remember you more." "Nah, later is worse. More time to get nervous." "My mom made me wear a Sunday shirt and bow tie to make a good impression." "You better play good, too." Mike looked at the paper that had been shoved in his hand. He was last in the order. Now, you realize that all of that I said before, you don't know where it's coming from. It doesn't matter. It's just all the boys' chatter in the room. The lady with the sash clapped her hands to get their attention. "We will proceed. Each of you will go into the adjoining reception room when your name is called. The jury is situated there. You will play the set piece followed by your optional piece. Then exit from the door on the other side of that room. Family members will meet you in the main hallway. The judges will not deliberate until Monday. The winners will be notified in the mail next week, and the results will be in the Inquirer next Saturday." She looked at her notes. "One more thing. The concert is tomorrow night. If you have any old harmonicas that you wish to donate to the collection box, bring them to the concert." Mike found a seat and patted his chest pocket where the harmonica rested. By now it felt like an old friend. In an odd way, it had made his plan to save Frankie possible, and it had brought him closer, even for a little while, to Aunt Eunie. All that from one little instrument. By what miracle had Mike and his harmonica found each other? Maybe Mr. Wilkinson, who'd sold it to him, had been right. Maybe the harmonica had chosen him. The door to the mayor's reception room opened. Another women's auxiliary volunteer smiled at them, then called the first name. The room fell silent. The boy stood, crossed the threshold, and was swallowed inside. The boys started talking again. "What's the collection box?" They take used instruments and fix them up and send them to poor kids in California who don't got a penny to their name." "Hoxie's always doing stuff like that. He's soft for any sad story. He's partial to orphans. Band is full of them. If you ain't got parents, it's practically a sure thing you'll get in. Just my luck, I got a ma and pa." "Don't say that," Mike blurted, surprising himself. Then more quietly he said, "You're lucky you've got a family." Mike waited and watched as one by one each of the finalists was called in. By the time the clerk called his name, he felt as if he might be sick. Mike walked into a paneled room that reminded him of Aunt Eunie's library. At the front, a 7-person jury sat behind a long table, each with a pencil and paper. The Women's Auxiliary Volunteer introduced the judges: the director of the city orchestra, the director of the community chorus, the Philadelphia Inquirer music critic, a councilman, the owner of a local theater, the mayor of Philadelphia, and Albert N. Hoxie. Hoxie was dressed in a band uniform. Stout and full-cheeked with wavy hair combed straight back, he looked like a model of kind authority. "You are Michael Flannery?" "Yes, sir." "Well then, son, we look forward to hearing what you can do. Good luck. You may begin whenever you're ready." Mike raised the harmonica and began his set piece. He played it just as Aunt Eunie had taught him, with no improvising and as technically perfect as he could. When he finished, he paused for a moment, looking at each judge, and then began America the Beautiful. He played the first verse nice and slow, like a lullaby. The second verse was the blues version with trills and chords and bend-in notes. It wasn't hard for Mike to drop into the music and testify to the journey he'd been on. His eyes closed and he traveled back, arriving at Amaryllis Drive, riding in the wagon with Mouse, lying on his cot in the dormitory, and staring at the wrinkled paint on the ceiling. Standing at Granny's window, waiting and listening to his mother sing to him and Frankie. He played the third verse like he and Frankie used to play it, the refrain sounding like a storm crashing up to the sea to shining sea part, where he slowed down, the notes calm and simple, clear and sweet. When he finally lowered the harmonica and looked up, the judges stared at him. Awkwardly, Mike shifted from one foot to the other. Had he played poorly? Several of the judges cleared their throats. They had all began to scribble on their pads. Mr. Hoxie stood, came around the table, and shook Mike's hand. "Thank you, Michael. That was a very impressive performance. You can pick up your tickets for the concert tomorrow night on the way out, and you'll receive a letter with the results of the competition next week. Good luck to you. You are a very promising candidate." Mike blushed, but this time with pride. "Thank you, sir." When they arrived home, Mr. and Mrs. Potter were waiting for them in the kitchen with a cake. "To celebrate," said Aunt Eunie. "But we don't even know if Mike made it," said Frankie. "When I was a girl," said Aunt Eunie, "my father insisted on cake after big auditions and before the results. He said cake should be as much for trying as for anything else." Mr. Howard looked at her and smiled. "If cake is for trying, then you deserve it too, Eunie," she smiled back at him. Mr. Howard rubbed his hands together. "You're in for a treat, boys. Mrs. Potter makes a delicious chocolate fudge layer." "That she does," said Mr. Potter. Mrs. Potter put a wedge in front of Frankie. "Wow," he said. "What does Mike get if he makes the band?" Mike blurted, "I get to start practicing again, right, Auntie?" Frankie giggled. "Auntie?" They all laughed. Mike felt his cheeks flush. The word had just slipped out. Had she minded? He glanced at her and she gave him a small smile and nodded, as if everything was as it should be. Make the band or not, he'd be leaving them all soon. Mike concentrated on his cake, taking a big bite so he could think about anything but his feelings. He glanced at each of them. Mr. Howard reached over and brushed cake crumbs from Aunt Eunie's sleeve. She took a napkin and dabbed at Frankie's frosting smudged cheek. Frankie looked at Mike and smiled with chocolate-coated teeth. Mr. and Mrs. Potter laughed at Frankie's antics. Mike took it all in. The kitchen, the laughter, the smell of chocolate cake that had been made for trying. He closed his eyes, hoping to capture this moment so he'd always remember when and where he had once belonged. Okay, now, Your questions talk about what was the purpose of the collection box. Okay, so what's the collection box for, and what are they going to do with them? Okay. Why did they want to celebrate before they got the results? Why did they celebrate before they got the results? And that, I'm going to go back. That's on the bottom of this page right there. So look at that very last paragraph. Wait, no, not there. This one. The very last paragraph. Look at that again and see what it says. And that has your answer to why they celebrate. And Aunt Uni said that's what her dad had always said to her before an audition. Okay? Now, in your comments, I want you to tell me if you think Mike is thinking correctly. Do you think that his thinking, he keeps thinking about he's going to go back anyway, and he's missing this, and he's sad, and do you think that he's thinking correctly? Or do you think that he has something wrong in his thinking? I want you to give me a good sentence telling me what you think. So I think Mike is thinking right because blah, blah, blah. Or I think Mike is confused, or I think he's got the wrong idea. Okay? You tell me what you think about what he's thinking.